down here, and then over here, and we change it to. Okay.
This table's like this. Yes. Okay. This screen is not working.
I was just looking at this, sir.
Yeah. We have an extra screen if we, I mean. At all. You can take a really music that you can't.
Comes out of all of
Maybe they're using the wrong connection. Yeah, they're using the wrong connection. I said those are failed, but I can do them from over here. It's probably seeing this VGA and freaking out.
Right now they have go back to using the computers.
No. Reset the system. So I think you're going to have to reset the system. Alan, I think you're going to have to reset the whole system to get it to recognize it.
Right now we're at the L1 right up here.
Yes.
And now we're going to prostitute shit. Just switch. Okay.
You're going to have to reset the whole system for it to read. Since I just did it? I'm hoping. Yes. I think it was just freaking out because it has VGA.
Okay, I'm going to think of the
Yes.
Cool. Okay.
Okay.
Change the input over here. Switcher down there.
No. They don't change any switches. You're a Nancy Walter age, aren't you?
As far as sound, Yeah, that would be
I have it down, but they should, the Baylor should have one of these.
Oh, no, because plug in there. Get them to fill the line.
Why?
Is there registration voters?
No.
They have to be on?
If the system's on, they're on.
Okay.
Nice job.
And will the bailiff be doing this? Okay, perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That is one, that's yours, actually, but I rolled over from over there. Would you like to move it? I can actually move it now, but I didn't leave this one. Yeah. That's not very much room on it. And then the judge can't see it. Can I push it back when I?
Yeah.
Okay, that was wonderful, thanks. I don't understand it, but he did.
Oh, yeah, no, we can pass it.
Careful.
Well, just because the thing that said like you?
Yeah, I think so. We'll have to communicate with the judge just to have it switch. We're prosecution and you're defense day. I think that's how it's labeled. Oh, is that what's happening? Yeah, strange.
There was switch before.
Yeah, just so when we're at prosecution and then when they're at defense day. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, it's called follow-up.
Oh, nothing, I'm just. Oh, that's the What's that?
Back in session.
Please be seated, thank you. Let's go back on the record and let the record reflect that all parties are present as well as the defendants. State, you ready to call your first witness?
We are. Could someone ask for Chief Eden, please? Chief Gorden Eden, Your Honor.
Okay.
Morning, Chief. Right up here, thank you.
Raise your right hand for me, please.
Yes, sir.
Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of law that the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please be seated.
Good morning, Chief. Could you introduce yourself for the record, please, sir?
Yes, my name is Gorden Edward Eden, Jr.
And Chief Eden, you are the man in charge of the Albuquerque Police Department currently.
I'm the chief of the Albuquerque Police Department.
And you were the chief at the time of the Boyd shooting on March 16th of 2014.
That is correct.
This was, I think you were 11 days into your tenure as chief at that time, something like that?
That may be correct.
All right. And this was the first shooting that you dealt with as chief of police with Albuquerque, is that right?
I'm subject to leading nature, and it's more than the foundation, it's more than preliminary stuff.
I'll rephrase, Judge. Was this
Thank
your
you.
first shooting, Chief?
Yes.
Chief, I want to ask you whether there is anything we can agree about. Do you believe, Chief, that police officers should be required to follow the same laws they enforce against the rest of us?
Yes.
And do you believe that police officers should not be above the law?
Yes.
Do officers derive their authority from the community? Is that where they derive it?
I think the answer to that is their authority is given by law.
And does that come from the community that allows them to exist?
I don't know how to answer that question.
Okay, let me see if I can refresh your recollection. Do you have a use of force policy?
Yes, I do.
And it's 252.1, and there is a policy statement at the beginning there. If you can look at that and see if that refreshes your recollection, the last sentence in that policy statement, sir, if you just take a look at that.
I've looked at it.
Okay. Don't police officers derive their authority from the community?
That's what's written in this policy statement, yes.
Okay. And any unreasonable force degrades the legitimacy of a police officer's authority, does it not, sir?
Objection, leading.
Let's rephrase the question, please.
Do you believe, Chief, that any unreasonable force degrades the legitimacy of that authority?
Yes.
When force is required, should officers only use that force which is reasonably necessary under a totality of circumstances to protect the sanctity of human life, preserve and protect individual liberties, and to effect lawful objectives?
Yes.
I'd like to talk to you about the difference between a show of force and a use of force. Are those two different things?
They can be.
Okay. Can you explain what a show of force is?
Sure. Show of force may be an officer that escalates their voice in a manner to gain control over the situation. The officer may choose to bring out an appropriate, less lethal type of weapon. Sometimes that is seen as a show of force.
Can I give you an example, and let me ask you about it? If someone says, I've got a beanbag shotgun, is that a show of force?
That would be a show of force.
All right. And so what would be a use of force?
Using that impact weapon.
All right. That's the beanbag shotgun.
Yes.
Okay. If you pull out a gun and point it at the ground, is that a show of force or a use of force?
That is a show of force.
Okay. If I point the gun at somebody, is that a use of force?
That is a show of force.
All right, and so until you pull the trigger, it's not a use of force?
That is correct.
All right. When somebody takes out a knife to show you, is that a show of force or a use of force?
That could be a show.
Okay. One of the laws that police officers are required to train on and know is the law of homicide and self-defense. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Is the law of self-defense that if you start the fight, you can't claim self-defense?
Your Honor, I'm objecting. He's now asking this witness to make legal conclusions, and we've already talked about that.
Let me ask it this way, Judge. Are your officers trained about under what circumstances self-defense is not available?
I don't believe I can answer that question. And the reason I say I do not know what they were trained to, these officers.
Well, and I'm not asking about these officers. I'm talking about the APD officers, Chief.
Okay, could you restate the question,
Sure.
please?
Are APD officers trained in what the situations that do not constitute self-defense?
Yes.
Okay. So if someone is the first aggressor, if I pull a gun on you and you pull a knife on me, I don't get to claim self-defense, do I?
Objection, question.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Objection, question calls for legal conclusion, and it's also legal.
Any response?
Judge, I don't think it is either. I think it is a hypothetical for this police officer. I could rephrase the question if you'd like.
And I think Mr. Bregman had an objection as well. Is
John
that
was leading, Your Honor.
leading? Okay. I'd ask that you rephrase the question, but I'll allow the question to be asked and answered.
All right. Under the circumstance where I pull a gun on you and you pull a knife on me and I shoot you, I can't claim that I was acting in self-defense, can I?
I don't believe I can draw a conclusion to that question, and the reason is that is a hypothetical situation, and there are other things that play into that example.
Right. If the passage of time, for example.
Objection, leading.
I'll allow that question.
Yes.
And the things are you saying that things on the ground can change, and that's why you can't give an answer to that question?
Well, the reason I don't think I can give an answer to that specific question is that you have to look at the entire situation in its whole to find out. You have to be in that situation, or you would have to be in a position to evaluate that situation to make that kind of conclusion.
Okay. And in the very simple situation where I pull a gun on you, I start the fight, and you pull a knife, and there's no passage of time, you're unwilling to say that I can't claim I was acting in self-defense after you defend yourself with a knife?
Could you restate that?
Sure. I pull a gun on you, Chief. You pull a knife on me. I say I shot you in self-defense. Just like that. No passage of time. I can't claim self-defense because you pulled a knife on me, can I?
Your Honor, I can't answer that question.
Based on asking for legal conclusions.
I tend to agree with the defense. I think it's calling for a legal conclusion, so I must sustain the objection.
All right, Judge. Do you know whether it was the APD officers or Mr. Boyd who first pulled a weapon out on March 16th of 2014?
I'd have to look at the videos.
Okay. You have not seen the videos of
No, I
Officer
have seen the
McDaniel?
videos.
Okay. Do you know if it was Officer McDaniel and Officer Hernandez who pulled a weapon first before Mr. Boyd pulled a weapon on March 16th of 2014?
Would those be the two open space officers?
Yes, sir.
To the best of my recollection, Mr. Boyd pulled the knives first.
Okay, is that an important thing for you to know?
It's just something to know. In other words, it would play a part in looking at the entire situation.
Okay, you were not aware then that your officers pulled their guns before Mr. Boyd ever showed any knives?
I saw the video once back in March.
Okay. Do you know, so you can't tell me how many seconds it was between those officers, between the time the officers said hello and then pulled their guns on Mr. Boyd? You
I
can't?
cannot.
All right. Do you provide training for your officers in dealing with the mentally ill and suspected mentally ill?
Yes, we do.
And do you also train them on the SOPs that you have on dealing with the mentally ill and suspected mentally ill?
Yes, we do.
Where did they receive training on dealing with mentally ill or suspected mentally ill subjects?
I cannot speak specifically to where they receive the training. Some of the training is done through having our officers read and review the standard operating procedures, and some of that training is conducted at the academy. Sometimes that training may be conducted in another location where training may be conducted.
Okay, and so APD does it internally, trains, has special programs where you train your officers on this SOP response to the mentally ill suspect and suspected mentally ill people?
Objection leading.
I'll allow the question.
The policy that you're speaking of, 2-13?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And it's your belief that, and I just want you to explain that more, that they also get that kind of training in the academy as well, is that right?
Same.
Sustain the objection. Please rephrase.
Where else do they get that training?
They may receive this training at the academy.
Okay. Do you get records of the for the officers that you hire of the training that they've had?
Records are retained by our training
And
division.
why do you keep records of the training that your officers receive?
Part of it is a statutory requirement where we have to satisfy a certain amount of hours of training.
All right. And do they keep track of whether they've received training in dealing with mentally ill people or people with mental impairments?
Yes.
And you keep those records as part of the ordinary part of the Albuquerque Police Department, do you not?
Yes.
And those are provided by the officers, or where do you get those records?
Those records are retained by the training academy.
All right. Let me hand you up to marked as States Exhibit 5 and States Exhibit 6. Counsel, you have in your binder. Can you identify those, please, sir?
States Exhibit number 5 is a certificate of completion to Dominic Pettis. It says Basic Crisis Intervention Training Certification for the Field Officer, dated May 19 through 23.
Can you look through that and see if those are the training records? That is a set of training records for Dom Pettis. Is that what those appear to be?
Yes.
And are those the kind of records that you keep on all of your officers?
Yes.
And can you look at the next exhibit, Exhibit 6, please?
Exhibit 6.
Yes, sir? And
Yes.
do those appear to be training records of Keith Sandy?
Yes.
Are those the kind of records that you keep in the ordinary course of your business there at the Albuquerque Police Department?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would move 5 and 6, and we also have a records custodian if the defense thinks we haven't laid the proper foundation for these records.
Is there any objection from the defense?
I don't have an objection, Your Honor.
No objection.
All right, 5 and 6 will be admitted without objection.
Okay. Chief, can you tell me, looking through, first of all, Officer Pettis' records, can you look through and see if there are any more training in dealing with the mentally ill highlighted in there? Particularly on the list of things from the academy. Yes, sir. Have you found any more training in crisis intervention and dealing with the mentally ill?
Yes, ma'am. In Block 10 of the 94th Cadet Class curriculum, there is a 40-hour block, crisis management.
All right. And in that, are you familiar with what gets taught at the academy?
Most of the parts, yes.
All right. Is it the same kinds of things that are in your SOP on dealing with the mentally ill?
Yes.
And why do you train your officers at the academy and also at APD in the things that are already in your SOPs?
Well, the important thing for us to do when we conduct training is to make sure that whatever policies and procedures guide the class that's being taught is that what's being taught is reinforced by using our policies and procedures.
All right. Let me hand you what's marked as State Exhibit 2, and do you recognize that as the policy on dealing with the mentally ill that was in effect at the time of the Boyd shooting?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd move State's Exhibit 2 into evidence.
Any objection?
No, no objection.
Other than what's already been argued before, no objection.
All right, 2 will be admitted.
All right. Chief, could you turn to to the second page, or third page, I'm sorry, of that SOP, Exhibit 2, 213. And I'd like to direct your attention, can you see that on your screen too, Chief?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I'd like to direct your attention to paragraph C here. I'm trying to zoom this thing. Let's see. And I think I'm just messing it up worse. All right. You see, under C, one of the things that you train your officers in is to calm the situation when dealing with mentally ill people.
Yes.
And then down here, to avoid physical contact if possible while assessing the situation.
Yes.
Why is that you have them avoid physical contact while trying to assess the situation?
The outcome of physical contact would be best determined by the officers that are dealing with that particular situation. And again, at the beginning of this policy at 2-13-03, it says if an officer determines that a subject may be mentally ill, the officer will attempt to respond in the following manner. And calming the situation is one of the options that is used. And sometimes avoiding physical contact may help.
Okay, is that a safety issue, or is that an issue with the mentally ill person themselves that some people don't like to be touched?
It could be both.
All right. And then down here on D, it talks about communicating with the subject, and under 4 it says do not threaten the subject with arrest or physical harm. Can you tell me why that's the advice and the training of your officers?
Again, it's one of those things that an officer has to look at after speaking with the individual in crisis to make a determination about what's going to be in the best interest of both the officer as well as the person. And sometimes threatening the suspect could escalate.
All right. And then here under 6, there is this advice. Always be truthful. If the subject perceives deception, he or she may withdraw and further complicate the situation. What does that mean?
Exactly what it states.
Okay. So if the person says, are you going to arrest me, what do you say as far as being truthful?
I think, again, it would very much depend upon the situation. I think you would have to look at the totality, the information that's being collected while you're in this particular incident.
Okay. Are all APD officers required to know what's in your standard operating procedures?
Yes.
And what are the SOPs written for? Are they written to protect the public from harm?
The standard operating procedures follow best practices across the United States. They're written for many reasons, and some of them do provide for safer community.
All All right. And is another one of the reasons to protect the Albuquerque citizens you might be investigating from harm?
It could be, yes.
And is another reason to protect your officers from harm?
It could be.
All right. An officer's decision not to follow the SOPs may endanger the lives of officers?
It could.
Okay.
Sustained.
And do you believe that an officer's decision not to follow the SOPs may endanger the lives of citizens?
It may.
All right. Do your officers receive training in use of force?
Yes, they do.
And where do they receive that training?
They receive that training at the academy.
And at the academy, is the training in the use of force practices that end up also in your SOPs?
Yes, it does.
Okay, and can you look through the training information for Mr. Officers Pettis and Sandy and tell me if they receive training in use of force?
Yes, they have.
All right. And would that training include training on your SOPs on use of force?
Yes.
Let me hand you from Marcus Exhibit 1, and can you identify that as the APD SOPs on use of force that were in effect at the time that James Boyd was shot?
Yes.
Your Honor, I move Exhibit 1 into evidence.
Any objection to 1?
No objection.
None that's not already been known.
State's Exhibit 1 will be admitted.
Right? As part of the training on use of force, do officers get trained in the concepts of distance? And I think they usually go together, distance and cover, but I want to talk to you about distance. They get training in that.
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
Part of the defensive tactics policy and the use of force policy has to do with the proximity the officer is to the suspect. And based sometimes on proximity, the threat can be greater
All right?
or less.
All right. What are officers trained about whether distance is their friend as far as safety is concerned?
Increasing distance or decreasing distance may be appropriate given the situation.
Okay, yes, sir. And if they want to remain safe, particularly from someone who might have a knife, are there any rules or drills that they're trained about distance?
I would say there's not a specific rule, nor a specific practice, because so much is driven by the situation more than it is by absolutes in either direction, either increasing the distance or decreasing the distance.
Is it fair to say that the farther away you are from a man with a knife, the safer you are?
Yes.
Unless, I guess, he can throw it if he's one of those knife thrower guys. But other than that, the safer you are, the farther away you are. Is that right?
That's generally accepted.
Okay. And it would it ever be appropriate for an officer to deliberately close distance on a suspect in order to justify shooting him?
It may, and again, it would have to depend upon the situation. And
If it was done on purpose, if I thought I was safe at this distance and I wanted to shoot you and I closed distance on you and put myself in danger, would that ever be appropriate to deliberately do that so I could shoot you?
Again, it would depend upon the situation. That's that. If you were the officer and you were closing on me, but I was holding somebody hostage, I may make a decision to close a distance. That's what I'm saying is that it's really driven by the situation that is happening.
let me just strip it out for you. It would never be appropriate for me to close distance solely for the purpose of shooting you where there was not a threat to somebody else. Is that
Objection
right?
leading.
Rephrase the question, please,
Yes.
counsel.
In a circumstance, would it ever be appropriate for an officer to put himself in jeopardy just for the sole purpose of shooting somebody?
Again, it would depend upon the situation, and it would be based on my perceptions of what the threat is. It would be based on many other factors. As I stated earlier, you would have to look at the totality of the situation.
So let me ask the opposite question. There are circumstances where if an officer wanted to kill somebody, it would be okay for him to put himself in jeopardy just for the purpose of killing somebody.
Objection leading.
Could we?
Asking the opposite, Judge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and allow this question, but let's try to stay away from leading
Okay,
questions.
Judge.
Could you restate?
You're saying there is a situation where it would be fine for an officer to put himself or herself in jeopardy just for the purpose of shooting somebody.
And again, it would depend upon the situation.
You're saying, yes, that would be appropriate.
It depends on the situation.
All right. When you took this job as chief at the beginning of March 2014, were you aware of the problems going on in Albuquerque or the concern in Albuquerque about the number of APD shootings?
Objection, relevance, confusion of the issue.
Join that.
Response, please.
I'm not going to get into the facts, Judge. I just want to ask about Mr. Boyd's, what Mr. Boyd would have known. I'm not going to go into detail about any of that.
Objection, question calls for speculation.
Join that as well.
Any response?
Judge, I think it's a fair question about whether Mr. Boyd might have known or be concerned about how APD officers would respond to him.
Well, I'll not sustain the objection unless you can establish some foundation that this witness particularly has knowledge of what Mr. Boyd was
All
thought
right.
about those situations.
You were aware when you took this job that the Albuquerque Police Department had a higher number of shootings of citizens per capita than any city in the country. weren't you?
Objection relevance.
Let me ask you again, counsel, what's the relevance of the fact there were other shootings?
Judge, I'm going to get into now the investigative practices that were in effect at the time and why he didn't change them.
I'll go ahead and allow the question to be asked and answered at this point.
I knew that the Albuquerque Police Department had a high number of officer-involved shootings.
Okay. Higher than other cities.
Objection leading.
Again, rephrase the question.
Were you aware that it was higher than other cities?
No.
Were you aware that many of those shot were in crisis or suffering from mental illness?
No.
Let's talk about how this investigation was handled. I think we've established this was the first homicide by police that was under your command. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you have rules in the department that prevent police officers from handling investigations of family members or friends?
Objection, relevance.
Counsel, can you tell me how this is relevant?
I'm going to move into how they handled this particular investigation and why they shouldn't have investigated themselves in this particular case, Judge.
And I would continue the objection, saying that has no relevance on whether or not our clients committed any kind of crime.
And I'm having a hard time finding the relevance. Tell me
Sure, Judge. Bias of the investigating officer in the investigating department is always relevant, particularly when they're going to claim that the APD couldn't make a match of the bullet in this case, for example, and I need to show why that was in this particular case.
Well, I'll conditionally allow you to ask the question, assuming that you're going to bring this other evidence forward later on.
I am, Judge. I sure am. Sir, do you have rules in the department that officers can't handle investigations of family members or friends?
I would have to look for it.
Okay. Do you believe that there is, and I don't want you to quote the exact policy, but is there a rule like that prohibits that?
Objection speculation, I think he's already said I'd have to look for that.
I'll allow the question to be asked and answered. Overruled.
You can answer.
I would have to review the policy on that.
Okay, well, let me ask the opposite. Do you let police officers investigate their family members?
Not normally.
All right. Why is that? Why would you not want to do that?
It would rise to a potential conflict of interest.
Okay. And what is the conflict of interest?
It being an immediate family member,
Why would that affect their investigation?
them being an immediate family member.
And why would that affect the investigation?
It could.
All right, because?
Objection leading because.
I'll allow the question.
I just believe it could happen.
All right. And it's not unusual for police officers to call their fellow officers their brothers and sisters in blue, isn't that right?
That is correct.
And there is a close bond of fellowship between APD officers, is there not?
Objection leading.
Counsel, you are leading.
Okay.
Please rephrase the question.
Is there a bond of fellowship between the APD officers?
Yes.
When you came to the scene of this homicide, and I understand you came out to the scene of the Boyd shooting, is that right?
Yes.
Why did you not assign an outside agency to investigate this case rather than have APD investigate its own officers?
Objection relevance.
Any response?
Yes, Judge, the relevance is the bias in the investigation.
All right, I'll allow the question to be asked and answered.
The Albuquerque Police Department is part of a multi-jurisdiction shooting team response. It's an MOU that has been in place for several years that participating agencies and officer-involved shootings for this metropolitan area are the New Mexico State Police, the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department, the Albuquerque Police Department, the Office of the Medical Examiner.
Yes, sir. Was there an Albuquerque Police Department officer put in charge of this investigation?
Yes.
And why did you not ask that another officer from an outside department be put in charge of this investigation?
I believe, without having it in front of me, but I believe that the MOU states that the investigating officer is from the lead investigative officers from the agency that's involved.
Yes, sir. And when you came on, you did not change that practice, is that right?
I was not aware of that MOU until that night.
All right. And you didn't change it that evening when you dealt with your first shooting, did you?
No, I did not.
Were you aware that the assigned homicide detective had come from a military background just like Officer Pettis?
I did not.
Were you aware that he joined the force about the same time as Officer Pettis and Keith Sandy?
No.
Does that, do you worry about any kind of conflict of interest when one officer is investigating another officer?
I don't, because we do it in other situations where there's either alleged criminal act or other types of misconduct.
Is there any concern about how the public perception about APD investigating its own?
Objection relevance.
I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. Would it concern you if this investigation was treated differently than an investigation into a non-police officer who shot and killed somebody?
Could you restate the question, please?
Sure. Well, let me back up one. Should an investigation into a police officer be handled just like an investigation into a citizen who kills someone?
The same investigative procedures would be used.
All right. Does it concern you if this investigation was treated differently than an investigation against a citizen who shot somebody?
Objection assumes facts, not evidence.
Well, I'm going to get to that, Judge.
I'll allow the question. Go ahead.
Yes.
All right. What do you entitle an investigation into a killing of one citizen by another?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part.
What do you call an investigation where one citizen has killed another citizen?
A homicide.
All right. And what was this investigation called? Do you know?
I do not know.
Okay, let me hand you to Mark States Exhibit 42. Can you tell the court what this investigation was entitled?
On the cover sheet, it says the Albuquerque Police Department Felony Supplemental Report Officer Involved Shooting has the case number and the case prepared by.
Yes, sir. It's called an officer involved shooting rather than a homicide investigation?
Yes, it is.
All right. And even though the Office of the Medical Investigator, do you know that the Office of the Medical Investigator determined this was a homicide?
Yes.
Can you tell me why you would treat this differently and call this something different on your police reports than you would in an investigation against a citizen?
Actually, that's pretty much standard operating procedure throughout the United States and officer-involved shootings. That is what they're called, is officer-involved shootings.
Rather than homicides?
That is correct.
Even though this was a homicide of James Boyd?
Objection leading, argumentative.
I'll ask that you rephrase the question.
Was this the homicide of James Boyd, sir?
Again, that you're asking me to draw a conclusion, and I was not part of the investigation. I'm sure that there are other documents out there that call it a homicide, including the OMI report.
And you said the OMI is part of the
OMI is part of the multi-jurisdictional shooting task force.
You don't have any reason to dispute what OMI determined, do you?
I do not.
Objection, lead.
I'll allow that question.
Let me hand you back what's been marked as 42, because there's an extraordinary thing in this police report that I've never seen in any other police report involving a homicide where a citizen's involved. And I want you to turn to page 11, and if you read that thing called a video advisory.
Objection, question was argumentative.
I'm sorry, counsel?
The question was argumentative, added commentary that was not part of the question. I'd ask to move to strike.
I'll go ahead and disregard that, sustain the objection, ask that you rephrase it, please.
Yes. As soon as he reads this, Judge, I'll rephrase it.
I've read it.
Oh, okay, good deal. And Your Honor, I also moved 42 into evidence. This is the first 11 pages of the investigative report that contains the cover sheet and then the page 11 with the video advisory.
Any objection?
Lack of foundation, Your Honor. This witness said that he did not personally review the investigation, so we cannot lay a foundation for its initiative evidence.
I'll be glad to lay the foundation through Detective Stone, Your Honor, but if I can just ask him about this video advisory.
I will allow you to ask him if he's aware of this,
Mhm.
but I'm not going to admit it 42 unless proper foundation is laid.
All right, Judge. Chief, have you ever read the police report in this case?
No, I have not.
Okay. I just want to ask you about this section. This video advisory essentially says...
Objection.
Your Honor, if he's never read it, would possibly use other than just simply reading it.
Judge, it's to show that things were done in this investigation that are not done in a investigation into a homicide by a citizen.
Mr. Robles?
Those questions would be appropriate for the case agent who did in fact prepare this report, but asking a witness who does not have knowledge to essentially speculate on what the case agent believed was appropriate and why this video advisory made sense, that's what was grounds for my objection.
The witness testified that he had not read the report, so I'm going to sustain the objection.
All right, Judge. Let me ask this general question then, Chief. Have you ever heard in any other homicide case where you're investigating a citizen of a caveat put in that kind of report where you say, we have videotape, but disregard the videotape because it may not actually show what a person was feeling or experiencing?
Objection, lead.
I'll allow the question, counsel.
I'm just trying to remember certain things.
Right. And let me make sure my question is clear. Any other investigation since you've been on APD into a homicide by a citizen where there's videotape, has APD ever put anything in the report that says disregard the video, you need to, because it might not be fair or accurate and you need to look at what's in the mind of the person rather than what's in the video? Have you ever done that in a homicide involving a citizen?
I have not.
Okay, and are you aware of any APD officer who's ever done a video advisory like this? In any kind of homicide investigation involving a citizen?
I can't speak to that at all. And the reason I say that is I typically don't go through all the pages of every homicide investigation.
Okay. Do you understand that this kind of thing could be used by the defense in a homicide case involving a citizen?
Objection, question calls for speculation.
I'll withdraw the question, Judge, and I'll move on to something else. Would it concern you if your criminalistics department said they couldn't make a match of this bullet, but didn't really do everything they could to try to match this bullet to the shooter.
You need to, I would object. Question calls for speculation. There needs to be a foundation that actually knows about any of this. Because he hasn't read the report as he has already testified.
Are you talking about any situation? Is that what you're talking about, Counsel?
No, I'm talking about this. Would it concern him if, in this case, where the criminalistic said it could not make a match of the bullet, if
Well,
the criminalistic...
I would just ask that you first ask the witness whether he knew this or not.
Oh, all right,
Okay.
Judge. Were you aware that that APD criminalistics claimed it could not make a match of the bullet in this case?
I was not aware of that.
Okay. I will go on to something else, Judge. Do you have an SOP that you train officers on about digital recording?
Yes.
And what kind of training do the officers get about digital recording? I'm sorry, Chief, what kind of training do they get about digital recording?
They're given a limited amount of training at the academy when it comes to the use of digital tape and digital recorders. They're basically shown how it works and what the expectations are within the policy, and then following proper evidentiary procedures.
All right. And in addition, are they required to read and understand the SOP on digital recording?
Yes.
And do they, if they have any questions, do you have a department somewhere in APD where they can go to ask questions about how it works or to download the information if they have any problems? Is there someplace like that they can go?
Yes.
Okay. Let me hand you what's marked as State's Exhibit 3, and is this the policy that's in effect at the time Mr. Boyd was shot on digital recordings?
Yes.
Your Honor, I move Exhibit 3 into evidence.
Any objection?
I don't have objection, Your Honor. Objection.
3 will be admitted without objection.
Is it a fair summary of that policy that officers are required to turn on their cameras in certain situations and then turn them in?
That is correct.
Do you know enough about this case to know that Officer Pettis turned his tape in accordance with this, turned his tape on and then turned it in after the shooting?
I'll ask that you rephrase the question, please.
Were you aware about whether there was any tape that was recorded and turned in this case?
Yes.
Okay, and which officer did that?
Officer Pettis.
And what about any tapes for Keith Sandy or his sergeant in rope, Rick Ingram?
I have no personal knowledge of that.
Okay, if they had tapes that either weren't turned on or weren't turned in, what kind of concern would you have about that?
Well, that would be part of the...
Objection, relevance.
Well, I feel that there's some relevance to it. I'll overrule the objection and allow the question be asked.
What would be your concerns, Chief?
Well, policy violations are things that we look at when we do the internal affairs investigation. And once the internal affairs investigation is over, it looks for specific policy violations. That report has not been turned in yet.
All right, and my question only was not what you know from the report, but would it give you some concern if officers either didn't turn their recorders on or didn't turn them in?
Objection, relevance. His concern is not relevant to the issues in this case.
A response?
I'm going to ask him what his concern would be about what happened to the tape and why it wasn't recorded or why it was destroyed, Judge.
I'll find there's some relevance to it. I'll allow the question be asked and answered.
Chief, what would your concern be if an officer didn't turn their tape on or didn't turn a tape in?
It would be a concern if there was a policy violation, and I believe that the internal affairs investigation, which does look at specific policy violations, those are the things that I always look for in any internal affairs investigation.
And what concern would you have or what presumption would you make if an officer actually erased a tape?
If there was proof that an officer had erased a tape, it would concern me.
And why is that?
Because it would be tampering with evidence.
Okay. Can I have just a second, Judge? Do you also have an SOP on how shootings like this should be investigated?
Yes.
And let me hand you what's marked as State's Exhibit 4. And is that the SOP in effect at the time of this shooting about how this investigation should have been done?
Yes.
We're going to move State's Exhibit 4.
Any objection to 4?
Judge, based on relevance, listen, I don't know, I guess they're attacking their own case, I don't know. But all the evidence that they've gathered, because I don't know how that's relevant, again, how they investigated later to the issues that are before you, and whether or not these two officers were justified in shooting this boy or not.
Bias of criminal.
Let me hear from Mr.
I'll
Roper.
join that objection. And also, this case, Chief Eden is not the case agent. Those questions, to the extent that there's any relevance to them, you might find that, are appropriate for the individuals who investigated the case, not someone who has yet to read the case. Again, this sort of reaches the level of speculation and asking the witness to comment on facts he does not know.
Response?
Judge, it goes to the bias of the department itself if they didn't handle this investigation in the way they are supposed to, particularly in the issue of this bullet issue as far as whether there was really an attempt to match this bullet or not, which we'll have more evidence about later.
Well, let me just ask you, what relevance is the bias, if there is any, from the police department?
If the court is going to allow, if the court's not going to allow any officers to give opinions or who were involved in the investigation to give opinions on this shooting, there may not be any. If they're going to allow them to give opinions on the shooting, I think their bias is relevant.
Well, I'm going to find that the bias of a department, whether it exists or not, in this proceeding is not relevant. I mean, if you're trying to assert that this witness is somehow biased.
No, sir, I'm not.
Okay. Then I'll sustain the objection.
One second, Judge. And has the use of force SOP that was effective on the date Mr. Boyd was shot been rewritten under your watch?
Yes, it has.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. And if you can give me back the one that I didn't give in. I think it was 4. Thank you very much. I'll pass the witness.
Just a second.
Okay.
Mr. Rose.
May it please the court?
Go ahead.
Good morning, Chief.
Good morning.
What I'd like to do is to ask you questions in somewhat the order in which the state asked you questions. I understand that you have in front of you Exhibit 5.
Yes, sir.
And Exhibit 5 are those records which reflect some of Officer Pettis' training records. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding.
Now, I wanted to go through those records so that the court has the opportunity to consider them as we discuss them. These are the records which someone, not you obviously, took from the APD Academy and provided to the state. Is that your understanding?
I have no understanding where the documents came from.
Okay. Now, with regard to the first certificate you see, you would agree with me that Dominic Pettis had successfully completed crisis intervention team training on May the 19th, or May the 23rd, 2014.
Yes.
So Officer Pettis is a certified CIT officer.
Yes.
And if you turn to the next page, you would find that Officer Pettis had received 8 hours of training on perimeter containment from the Department of Public Safety.
Yes.
Now, there was a time when you were the chief of training for the Department of Public Safety, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then you subsequently became the cabinet secretary for DPS.
Yes, sir.
Now, DPS is the entity in the state of New Mexico that dictates what training should or should not be given to law enforcement officers who are certified under New Mexico law.
Yes, sir.
Now, in your position as both the head of training and also as the department secretary, is it your understanding that the role of the Department of Public Safety with regard to its satellite academies, that is the Albuquerque Police Department Academy, is that you determined what training was appropriate and you also mandated what training should be given to the officers who were attending the academy?
Yes.
And the same thing goes with advanced training, that both under the regulations promulgated by the Department of Public Safety and its analysis of what needs to be trained upon, that the biannual training that's given to law enforcement officers across the state, including the Albuquerque Police Department, is dictated by the state.
It's dictated by the state and also various state statutes.
Okay. Now, turning back to the exhibit that I had in front of you, perimeter containment, that's a course that DPS taught.
Correct.
Now, turning your attention to the next page. Now, we look at that and we find that in 2012, Officer Pettis received biennium training that was entitled Interaction with Persons with Mental Impairments.
Yes, sir.
So that's an example of when the state legislature mandated training that was then implemented by the Department of Public Safety and was required of the Albuquerque Police Department to provide to its officers.
Yes.
Turning your attention to the very next page, this is another example of biennium training. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, although I can't say that I can read everything that's here because the copy isn't of the quality I had hoped, you can see that there is use of force training mandated by the state. Is that correct?
I can't tell you if it was mandated by the state or part of the content. The copy that I have, it's difficult to see through the badge to see exactly.
Okay. But it wouldn't surprise you that there came a time when the Department of Public Safety required officers, after they've left the academy, to receive updated training on use of force.
Correct.
And they also received legal updates from the Department of Public Safety.
Yes.
And that's something that happens not just in Albuquerque, but statewide,
Yes.
controlled by the Department of Public Safety.
The training is required by the Department of Public Safety, and training curriculum is sent out from the academy to the various satellite academies. And I think that's the best way to answer that question.
Would it be fair to say, with regard to the basic academy, and have you turn the page to the document that's entitled Albuquerque Police Department 94th Cadet Class Curriculum? You see that?
Yes.
That the Department of Public Safety closely controls the content of what is taught by the satellite academies, including the Albuquerque Police Department's training academy.
Yes.
And that, for example, with regard to use of force, that a satellite academy cannot train use of force in the way that it deems proper. The use of force curriculum required of the Albuquerque Police Department, that is, they're required to train, is in fact a course that is prepared by and essentially audited by the Department of Public Safety.
Correct.
The outline is prepared by the Department of Public Safety.
The lesson plans.
And in this time, for the 94th class, is it your understanding that the reactive control model was the paradigm by which officers were trained regarding the use of force for all officers throughout the state of New Mexico, including the Albuquerque Police Department?
I have no knowledge of that.
Okay. Does it surprise you when I asked you that question that the reactive control model would have been the standard by which all law enforcement officers, including APD officers, were trained back?
Object to the question, Judge, is speculative. He said he couldn't answer the question.
Any response?
Because Chief Eden was the director of training and also the cabinet secretary, I'm asking him, sort of to dig a little bit deeper, because these are questions that, because of what he did in his past, well, hopefully will come to him.
Now, I'm going to sustain the objection and ask you to move on.
Now, when you look at the first page, do you see under DPS Class 2.5 that Officer Pettis would have received training on the legal aspects of deadly force?
Yes.
Now, when an officer takes an oath to become a law enforcement officer, they essentially swear to uphold the United States Constitution.
Yes.
And the New Mexico Constitution.
Yes.
That's their first duty. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, after that, an officer swears to faithfully enforce the laws and the statutes. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's second.
Yes.
Now, when an officer is taught the law regarding deadly force, you would agree with me that it's the law that controls when an officer should or should not use deadly force.
Objection beyond a foundation, Judge, I think, for this.
I'll allow the question to be asked and answered. Overruled.
The foundation for the use of deadly force is based on the Constitution as well as case law, and if there's any specific state law as it pertains to the use of force.
So the guiding principles, as you know, and this goes back to your days as the head of training for the Department of Public Safety and also as a cabinet secretary, and now that you find yourself the chief of police for the Albuquerque Police Department, is that you try to create policies that mirror the law.
We try to create policies that are consistent with the law.
But if the policy is inconsistent with the law, would you agree with me that an officer should follow the law and not the policy?
The law should always prevail.
Now, with regard to Officer Perez's training, is it your understanding, by looking at the curriculum you have in front of you, that he underwent a DPS-approved class on use of force?
That is correct.
And you would agree with me that Officer Perez also underwent a class entitled Edge Weapons Awareness?
Yes, in Block 5.
Okay. So these are all courses which DPS has approved and requires not only of Albuquerque Police Department cadets, but cadets across the state.
That is correct.
And the reason why you want all cadets to be trained similarly is so that they respond similarly.
It's to provide consistency.
Now, turning your attention to the SOPs and having you consider 2-13, the response to the mentally ill and suspected mentally ill and people in crisis, the state's exhibit number 2, you were asked a series of questions about that SOP. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Now, with regard to that SOP and most SOPs, wouldn't you agree that training is what makes sense of SOPs and allows officers to determine if the provisions of the SOP are appropriate in a given circumstance?
Yes.
Now, you understand, both during the time you were a law enforcement officer and in the years and years after, and I don't mean to age you, but you have been doing this for a long time, that the most fundamental concept in law enforcement training is to have an officer understand contact cover.
Yes.
Now, in contact cover, if it's done correctly, you have two officers who engage a suspect. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
And one officer makes contact, that is, talks to the suspect. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes.
And the other officer provides cover, that is, looks around, makes sure that everything is safe, and if action needs to be taken, they're in a position where they can essentially act upon the threat that they see.
Yes.
And that's a basic, although a lawyerly examine or review of what contact cover is. Is that fair?
Yes.
So when you look at, for example, SOP 2-13, and you look at the provision Ms. McGinn had asked you to look at, and that is 213-03, you would agree with me that the concept of contact cover overshadows this particular provision because you wouldn't want two officers trying to talk with someone who's suspected mentally ill. You would want only one officer talking. Does that sound about right to you?
Again, I think it would depend upon the situation, on how the situation was going. And I think, again, I'll get back to what I had said earlier, is that you have to look at the totality of the situation. And I think for me to just give an absolute yes or no would not be appropriate.
You would agree with me that two voices speaking at once might create confusion.
Yes.
And that the concept of contact cover, in order for it to perform effectively, you couldn't have two people talk, because if both people are talking, one person isn't covering.
It could happen.
Right.
And so, in order to judge this particular SOP in the context of this overarching training principle, not everyone can talk to a suspect because someone has to cover it.
That could happen.
And with regard to making contact with someone who's mentally ill, you would agree with me that by providing multiple voices, that only creates confusion.
It could add confusion.
And that you only want one voice to speak with to someone who's mentally ill because that helps reduce tension, reduce confusion, and allows for real rapport to happen.
That could be the case.
And you don't want officers' attention divided, that is, having a cover officer also talk to a suspect, because the officer can't provide accurate cover if his attention is divided.
That could happen.
Now, you would agree with me that this SOP is fact-specific. You do not know how to apply it until you're in the middle of the situation.
That is correct.
There are times when some of the provisions make sense, and there are times when some of the provisions don't make sense.
And again, the situation sometimes dictates how the situation evolves. So at the beginning of 2-13-03, it says if the officer determines that a subject may be mentally ill, the officer will attempt. In other words, it's a guiding principle that they should attempt these things.
And it's the training that helps the officer understand if it's appropriate to use the procedures identified in the SOP in the situation that they confront.
Yes, that could be the case.
And so without training, the SOPs cannot be seen as an overarching, as basically as a substitute for, or let me rephrase, I confused myself there, that the SOP is not a substitute for training. Is that a fair statement?
I think that is a fair statement, yes.
And that in order to accurately apply the SOPs for any officer, they need to be trained on them.
Yes.
Now, with regard to this idea that the SOP 2-13 was enacted to provide for the safety of the individuals with whom the police encounter, wouldn't you agree with me that in order for an officer to begin a dialogue with anyone, that officer has to ensure that the situation is safe for dialogue to occur?
Yes.
So this whole idea that there are techniques available to deal with someone who's mentally ill cannot occur until the officer has determined that it is safe to do so.
That is correct.
And that, in fact, is the training the Albuquerque Police Department has provided.
Yes.
Now, you were asked certain questions about bias. You were asked certain questions about favoritism and things of that nature. Again, has anyone brought to your attention that the investigation in the James Boyd shooting case was biased?
No.
Has anyone brought to your attention any concerns that favoritism was shown in the investigation of the James Boyd shooting?
No.
I guess I should ask. Is it fair to say that although there have been criticisms of the James Boyd shooting, the quality of the investigation and the investigators who investigated have never been called into question? Is that right?
Nobody has brought that to my attention.
May I confer you up?
Yes.
No further questions. Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Okay, before we do that, Mr. Bregman, I see we're already at the lunch hour, sir. I'm going to have to ask you we could wait till after lunch for you to do your calls. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the court will be in recess. We'll reconvene at about 1:20 this afternoon. Be in recess.
All rise.
Huh?
Chief. Just do that. Okay, I'm gonna put it back up when I have Jeff delivered it. I just really had it up for an email. No, I don't. So, yeah.
Did I doubt you?
Really, I mean,
I mean, you know, it's fun.
I put it for the opening. So, yeah, no, you can bring it back to me. And I just think I should go get it. Before you said I was saying, I should go get that picture because it's gonna be an explain.
Oh, let them know, yeah.
So used to having integrity questions.
Oh, yeah, no, well, no. You don't cheat. You don't cheat.
No, I